Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MPC Seminar of the Month. And I'm happy to see so many people joining us today in person and also online. So I'm Fujibayashi, Max Weber Fellow at the Migration Policy Center here at the EUI, and I'm chairing the session today. So today we welcome Dr. Federica Zardo as a speaker. And Federica is, I just read some highlight of her bio. So Federica is currently a senior researcher at the Danube University in Krems, Austria. And also she's a lecturer at the University of Vienna. She's been visiting us, the MPC, for roughly 2 weeks. So, and I'm very happy to make this seminar happening during her stay here. So she holds a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Turin in Italy. And she mainly works on international relations and public policy, specifically focusing on EU migration policy and external action. And she is currently the principal investigator of the MigFund project, funded by the Australian Science Fund, FWF. And she'll be mainly presenting on the database coming out of this project today. So before handing it over to Federica, I'd like to make a few housekeeping notes. So Federica will speak for roughly 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for the Q&As. And for those who are joining online, if you have any question, please use the raise hand button on Zoom or write down your question in the chat box so that I can read up your question. And please note that the session will be recorded and organized in a hybrid mode. So for those attending in the room, so please remember to turn on your microphone while you're speaking and turn it off when you stopped. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Federica. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for hosting me these 2 weeks. I'm really enjoying the say, and it's a good opportunity, actually, that I have to really present the first output, the main output of my project, which is called MigFund. And as mentioned before, it started 1 year ago, so I'm 1 year ahead in the analysis. And this is the first output that we produce. And I say we because I'm the principal investigator, but online, Rafael Cervenis actually supported me a lot in this data collection effort, and was really the person in charge of chasing the documents and looking through them. So as I said, I'm more presenting the database as such rather than real findings based on that, but I'm introducing some preliminary observations. But in a way, this is also an opportunity to discuss its structure and see how it can be improved and reflect on the way we structured it. So the MigFund project aims at understanding and so tracing first, and then understanding the evolution of funds for migration, EU funds for migration and asylum from 2000 onwards, and understand the dynamics behind that. The starting point was that if we look at the EU budget across multi-annual financial frameworks, we really see an increase in the budget allocated in the area of so justice and home affairs, which is the blue line that you see there. And then within the red line, which is the external affairs headings, there have been increasing number of amounts of money dedicated to the field of migration and asylum. And this is despite, at the policy level, we saw at some point a lack of reform and a lot of conflicts in how to reform migration and asylum policy. So we saw, on the other hand, an active dynamism in the field of funding. And I wanted to explore what explains this dynamism, what are the dynamics that are behind the programming of the design and the programming of funding, and if we see differences between somehow the policy level and the funding level, acknowledging that there might be some dynamics that pertain to the phase of designing and programming. So the two questions that I address in my project was first, an empirical one, which is what is the trajectory of change in EU funding instruments for migration and asylum. And after that, so that's the step that is waiting for me in a way, what are the drivers of change in EU funding instruments for migration and asylum? So the main assumption is that the social construction of policy tools may take place at all stages and may apply also at the stage of the design of fund, which means that once funds are established, they don't become autonomous somehow, but they're not isolated, but they become autonomous in a way. From the political debate, they acquire autonomy. So policy officers in charge of designing the programs may strategically decide to deviate from somehow and to some extent from the intended approach, the initial objectives, reinforcing somehow or attenuating some of those goals based on bureaucratic considerations, based on institutional logics, and those logics are those that I would like then to address in the explanatory phase of my project. And so I expect that all these considerations may affect the operationalization of funding. So in order to do that, we had to engage in a data collection process, tracing all the funds that have been committed by the EU from 2000 onwards. And I focused on both the funding pertaining to Home Affairs, so under DG Home, back to heading 3, dedicated to internal policies in 2000, up to the newly established heading 4 for migration and border management, and also somehow heading 5 on security and defense. But knowing that most of, there is an increased focus on the so-called external dimension of migration, we decided also to cover and track all the measures that have been programmed and committed from 2000 onwards under the external action heading. So under those programs dedicated to development, neighborhood, and enlargement, following then the development of heading 4 up to the current heading 5 for neighborhood and the world. So this is a rough overview that might not be easy to read of all the programs that we tracked from 2000 onwards under internal affairs, so and external affairs. So from the development of Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, the Internal Security Fund, the Border Management Fund, and for the external area, tracing the development of the ENEAS programs up to the most recent Neighborhood Development International Cooperation instrument. So the data collection really started with analyzing for all these programs the establishment and implementation regulations. But this was not enough to really track and understand which measures the European Union was committed funding to and which amount was allocated to every measure. For that, we had to consult the multi-annual indicative programs and the strategy papers to really connect each entry to a specific amount that the European Commission allocated to each measure. And the main sections that we analyzed for all these programs were the objectives, the priorities, the outputs, the expected outputs, the results, the budget, of course, but also the management and implementation rules to really also understand who would then be more in charge of the implementation phase, more the Commission or the member states or implementing agents. I just want to clarify here that unlike many attempts to trace funding that we know exist, actually, here I'm really focusing on the commitments. First of all, because there is a clearer picture of what has been programmed and committed, while when it comes to spending, all the efforts that have been made at tracing all the spending did not result, were not comprehensive in the end, because it was hard to reconnect all of that. But also because, since my goal is to trace and understand the relationship between the policies and the funds, I thought that the commitments and the programs really help understanding the strategic considerations that may lie behind the design phase, and also the priorities that actors may have, the constraints that they may have when designing and translating policy objectives into funding priorities and interventions. So I try to, well, once all the data collected, we went through a coding phase to understand, on the one hand, the amount, of course, dedicated to, committed to this, to all these measures, but also the real content, which I defined as the scope of the committed measure, in terms of what will be funded, in which sub-policy area, because although they fall under migration policy, they might be related to border and land management, legal migration and mobility, irregular migration and return, asylum and migration, and so on and so forth. Who was a target group of those measures? So they could be regular migrants, irregular migrants, all migrants together, asylum seekers and refugees, vulnerable people, depending on the definitions. And I think that all these definitions really provide provide us with some information about what's the goal behind the funding. So what's the target in terms of region, but also country, and the type of intervention, if it's more about capacity building, infrastructural investments, research and data collection, and so on and so forth. And then the second step was to try to understand if behind definition of a measure, the measure was placing more emphasis on curbing migration. So if the measure was conceived as somehow restrictive, following some definition of restrictive open policies in many other data sets that analyze policies rather than funding, or on protecting migrant rights. So if the definition of the measure and the objectives is more open. And then coding from -1 to +1, depending on the level of the restrictiveness of the content of the measure. So here I included a little bit of a screenshot of the data set, just to show, since this is the goal of this presentation, to really present the effort and the data set itself. So each entry really corresponds to one single measure within the program, knowing that the unit of analysis is the program itself, but it's made of different measures that combine, then form the whole program. And for each measure, you have the information about the funding program, whether it's thematic or geographic, what is the specific measure, what is the policy area, the sub-policy area it pertains to, what is the category, which can be, as I mentioned, refugees, asylum seekers, irregular migrants, and so on and so forth. But then also the type of operation, which is defined in the indicative description, the level of restrictiveness, and this applies both to the internal dimension and the external dimension. So here what you see is the external part of the external dimension of the data set, but you will also have then, one can also then find the external dimension of it. I move on just to save on time. So this is the internal data set. So and then I started looking at some of the trends that emerged from the data set, where we really see, for example, so this is an analysis of the external dimension, so which is the most completed one, because for the internal one, I'm still polishing the data set and I couldn't yet conduct a fully fledged analysis. But we really see, first of all, that there is a spike in measures dedicated to migration in development cooperation programs, starting from 2015 onwards. This is no surprise for all of us, especially if we take into account that here also the trust funds are included. So both the trust funds for Africa, for Syria, and for Turkey. But if we look at then how the trends are when it comes to the different policy areas, then we see that a huge amount of measures was committed under the level protection. So the strong protection component, and especially of the trust fund for Syria and for Turkey, really explain this spike in measures dedicated to protection, followed by finally the operationalization of the so-called root cause narrative that really links in the funding, migration and development that we see in orange. And while we see that, for example, for legal migration, definitely the trend is less important. There are not so many measures dedicated to legal migration and mobility. But we also see that, for example, crisis prevention was not an objective before 2015 and at all. While border and land management and irregular migration and forward return also increased, but in a more linear way. If we look at what the measures really aim at, this comes from the analysis of the restrictiveness of those measures. And here, in order to capture both the absolute restrictiveness of the measures, but also the relative restrictiveness of the measures, I created two kind of codes and information. One which definitely only codes the content of the measures, where we see that, for example, the most restrictive measures were included in the period 2000-2006. While if we look at 2021-2027, most of the measures look like more open when it comes to dedication to protection, to saving lives, and so on and so forth. But if we combine the level of restrictiveness with the amount allocated to that measure, the picture changes, and we really see that in 2000-2006, most of the measures dedicated to more open interventions, so dedicated to protecting migrants, enabling circular mobility at the time, received most of the commitments, unlike those measures that were dedicated to border control and control of irregular migration. While if we look at 2021-2027, we see the opposite, when most of the money actually are dedicated to border control and irregular, not only border control and irregular migration, but are dedicated to measures that, even if they fall under legal migration and mobility or regular or migration and development, they are conceptualized in a way that is somehow trying to constrain and control migration. And we see that also in this evolution across sub-policy areas of the restrictiveness somehow, where we see that this is kind of expected, but the most restrictive measures are, of course, those dedicated to border and land management, irregular migration and forced return. But we also see that, for example, migration and development is rather along the zero line, which means something, which means that always when defining and programming measures dedicated to development, there is a strong definition, there is a strong component of control in it, which balances somehow the development component in the measures, and we see that as a trend all across the multi-annual financial frameworks. The dataset, of course, tries also to understand the differences across programs. And I jumped, not to take too much time and leave time for the discussion. For example, if we look at the most recent NDCI instrument, we see some expected results, but some others that really deserve some more attention, because, of course, the less restrictive measures are those dedicated to migration and development and protection somehow. But at the same time, the definition of legal migration and mobility measures are result in restrictiveness. So whenever addressing legal migration and mobility, there are always objectives and interventions and indicated activities that that somehow try to link legal migration to control. So in a form of conditionality, but also in the way the objectives are framed. And it's interesting to see, for example, that unlike in the past, this is something that I could already observe, the thematic programs are more open somehow, while in the past thematic programs were rather trying to counterbalance the more development and oriented and open components of geographic programs, for instance. So discussing some of the challenges and limitations. So overall, in this huge exercise, we missed only some cases, but there were some issues in the availability of data. So in some cases, 3.9%, we could not collect the data at the specific indicative amount allocated to the measures. And this pertains specifically to the internal dimension. So for the AMIF and ISF, especially from 2018 onwards, there is no precise allocation for each union action. So it's difficult really to understand what the European Union is, what the Commission is trying to do with the union actions and what amount are dedicated to it. And the geographic scope of several measures is very broad. So it was hard to really trace the geographic scope of every intervention. One of the challenges was, of course, the coding phase to understand, to avoid subjective interpretations. So when the wording of a measure was too ambiguous, for instance, or overly broad, we rather turn to supplementary sources, such as, for example, the rationale of the intervention of the program, the intervention logic sections of the annual action plans. And of course, one of the bias that we are aware of is that we had to exclude until the current programming period the European Development Fund from the external dimension, because this was outside the EU budget until 2021, as well as those measures following under ECHO or the Instrument for Security and Peace, for instance. Some preliminary observations that I would like to introduce based on the first analysis. So on the one hand, we really see that the protection of the containment paradigm is ongoing, but in the way measures are operationalized when dealing with external funds, there are attempts from within to challenge the containment paradigm and the root causes narratives through different strategies that might be allocate more money or less money to restrictive and open measures, somehow create the appearance of control, which is really visible in many measures. I included here an example of a project that was, if I'm not wrong, under the U-Trust Fund for Africa, for example, where the goal was to strengthen social cohesion, urban governance, and then the rest of the measure was really a development cooperation measure. But then there was this definition of in order to prevent Uganda from becoming a country of origin or transit, which really fitted not well in the whole rationale and definition, trying to really create the appearance of control under the purely development measure. One of the other strategies to try to balance this protection and development, this containment and development component was to blur the categorical boundaries of the measures that have become from 2000 onwards really broader, with multiple objectives and multiple indicative activities that really leave to the implementing actors a lot of leeway to do what fits more their objectives. And then we also see a strategic balance between the thematic and geographic programs, with thematic programs that were in the past relatively more restrictive than geographic ones, but that's different for in DCI, and this is something that I would like to explore more. I stop here, but as I said, so this is really a very preliminary part, because the goal of this seminar was to present the data set, discuss it in order to improve it if necessary before a full publication. So I leave it here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and your comments on it. Thank you very much.
As I said, I'm going to open up the floor. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. Martin. So yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. A lot of people find this data set very helpful. I have two questions. One, could you just explain a little bit how big is the gap between the commitments and the spendings? Do we know that? And to what extent is this gap variable across different types of interventions? That's my first question. The second question is, so obviously a lot hinges on the coding. So could you say a little bit more about the coding? It sounds like you've come up with one aggregate score, but I mean, there are protective elements in there, then there might be restrictive elements vis-a-vis kind of migration flows, but there could also be, as you say, elements that promote migration. So it might also be helpful to actually have different, more micro level indicators because one thing I think that would be really helpful to do is actually you could characterize. So for example, you could take the EU-Turkey statement and kind of describe it in terms of what it does, right? In terms of the protective elements, in terms of the control elements, in terms of the kind of legal pathway elements. So I think that would be quite helpful as well. So if you could just say a little bit more about the coding and what level of detail will be there and how you've actually done it. I mean, how did you decide that this is a +1 or a +2? Or
Thank you, Federica. Thank you a lot. I'd like to know if you have, what is your funding, or if you have any idea about the place of the implementation level in these funding programs. And also, because you focus on irregular migration and return, which seems to be let's say the one policy area in which most EU countries agree, especially return. Is there something more specific on immigration detention connected to forced returns or voluntary return? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I found the presentation very interesting. I have a couple of questions. The first one was trying to understand what you meant by restrictiveness. I think it kind of ties to Martin's question about coding, because it was interesting that you found all these results, but I kept asking what went into into making up the box of restrictiveness. How do you identify what is really a restrictive measure or not? Yeah, and the second question had to do with excluding EDF. I was wondering why you excluded EDF, because part of the funding for the EUTF, for the trust fund, came from the EUF, no? Or part of the funding for the trust fund came from the EDF?
Mostly on neighborhood and development cooperation.
Yeah, but for the trust fund for Africa, part of the funding was also from the EDF. So I was wondering why you excluded EDF, and there were several other migration related measures under the EDF. So I don't know, maybe you could explain a bit, that a little bit. And then again, this question of coding, how did you identify which projects were really migration related projects? Because like you said in your findings, some of the project descriptions have become really broad, right? So you have like multiple measures in there. So how are you able to identify that this is really a migration related project? Because I mean, if you look at some of the measures, you have WASH projects that are now linked to migration and things like that. So how are you able to really specify? And then again, I think your overall question was like you were trying to determine how these policies and the design of these policies are translated into funding and all that. And I was wondering, what's the role of the partners in all of these? Because at the end of the day, you have this MIPs that are discussed also with the partner countries, and you have these projects that are implemented together with the partner countries. So how do they factor, how do they fit into this whole thing about understanding where the policies are going and looking at the funding to see how they translate policy implementation? Yeah, thank you.
I think Federica had enough question to answer, so I will give her time to respond question, and then will be there are a couple of hands online, so I will back your question and so yeah.
Thank you very much. I will try to put some order. So first of all, we're not here because you mentioned the word projects. So here we're not talking about project level, with the exception of the UTF for Africa, for Syria, and for Turkey, where there was this step missing of programming, where you had the amount of money that translated immediately into project proposal without a programming phase. In all the other cases, we're talking about measures within the program. So every program has, of course, different measures that can be supported. So we're not talking about the project level, but on the program level, and within the program, the different measures. And this, of course, affects your question about the role of the partners, which is more relevant, might be more relevant in some cases and less relevant in others. In some cases, most of the programming exercise really relies on is the commission in charge the commission in charge of it. But then, of course, part of the explanatory phase will, of course, try to understand what's the role of the different partners in drafting, for example, the multi-annual indicative programs. But depending on the programs, we might see more or less involvement of the different actors into the design of the programs. So concerning the definition of restrictiveness, I know before. So what we decided was migration related and what not. Basically, we analyzed all the programs that existed in under the internal dimension and external dimension. So both the geographic programs and the thematic programs. So the thematic programs have a label on it when they are targeting migration. So if it were whether or not migration is in the title, but in the definition of the program, there is a clear definition of what the thematic program is targeting. Within the geographic program, we read all the different measures and identified when and to what extent migration was present. So if through content analysis, if the word migration, mobility, a refugee, asylum, but also protection was included through a granular analysis through content analysis of the different programs, and identified all these different measures. So this really allowed to capture, I would like to say, the majority of it with a quite good level of certainty. Concerning the definition of restrictiveness, so we relied on the definition of the measure, the way the objectives were described, the kind of interventions that were programmed, and we identified whether the measure was was exclusively targeting migration control, less target, so then in that case it was -1. If the measure was targeting protection and mobility rights, then it was fully targeting, it was fully coded as +1. And then from minus 0.5 to plus 0.5, depending on the relevance of control measures in the definition of the objectives, the intended actions, and the expected results, depending on the balance of and the wording of the definition of the measure. So if it was equally targeting migration control and protection of migrants and mobility rights, then it was in that case 0. If it was minus 0.5, there was a prevalence of restrictive measures and control and interventions dedicated to control, but with a nuance of protection in the objectives, and the same goes for the plus 0.5. So that's the way in which we try to really understand what was the core of the measure, what was really the objective of the measure, and if it was more dedicated to controlling or enabling mobility and protecting rights. Concerning the EDF, the exclusion of the EDF. So first of all, there was a problem related to the availability of information. That was, of course, one important element. The second one was that the starting point was the EU level and the role of the Commission and EU actors in designing the funding, and knowing that in EDF, of course, the role of the member states is definitely higher in the design and programming of those measures. We decided to exclude it. So it was a combination of the starting point of the analysis, if really funds really follow the logics of the policies, or we see some logics that drive the design and funding or not. And in that case, since our level of analysis was the EU level, then we decided to exclude the EDF for that reason. But there was also a huge and important role played by the availability of the information for all the EDF commitments from 2000 onwards. So the coding, I addressed the point. Concerning the implementation, in each measure, I identified actually what are the main implementing actors of the measures, and of course, we see some trends that have been already identified in previous research, such as the increasing importance of international organizations and so on and so forth. But we didn't, since the level is not that of the project, but of the programs, we cannot know exactly which measures have been implemented by which actors afterwards. So that was the possibility offered by the European Commission, and then this has to be compared with the actual implementation level. Concerning migration detention, I don't know, so I have to admit I have to go back to it and identify it. I remember having checked recently the commitments dedicated to targeting Libya, and there I saw that, for example, detention was included in one of the recent measures funded in committed for Libya in DCI recently. So that was what I remember. But this is the kind of analysis that I would like then to explore afterwards, once the data set is approved somehow and it's completed. There was still one question about from you, Martin, about the gap. Yeah, okay. So based on the evaluations, we realized that there is not much gap in terms of between commitments and spending, at least at the program level. But across measures, this is something that might be more difficult, especially for the internal funding. For the internal funding, there is a gap between commitments and spending, which is quite important. But it's difficult to identify from the level of commitments, from the level of commitment to the level of the implementation, at which under which sub-policy area the gap applies, while it's easier to be done for the external dimension, where the gap is not that relevant. And in a way, the dataset also includes all the amendments that have been done once the evaluations and midterm evaluations that were based also on the spending was completed. So in a way, this helps understanding where the Commission decided to reallocate money that was not spent under the previous 3 years, 2 years, depending on the evaluation. So of course, this does not mean that one can compare precisely all the level of commitments with all the level of spending, but this is more related to the missing information at the spending level than the information at the commitment level. But I checked already with the Commission, and for the external dimension, the gap is not that important. If I manage to really identify the gap at the measure level, this is going to be probably difficult, but at the aggregate level, at the program level, this has already been done, and it's not that huge. Okay, I think I addressed it.
Excellent. So there are a couple of hands I can see from online, so I'm going to invite those attending from online. So first, Maria Vittoria, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but please unmute your microphone and then speak up. Go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you very, very much for this super interesting and needed presentation. I have 2 questions and maybe 1 suggestion. The first question is about the content areas of the different programs. I work for the European Training Foundation. We are supporting DG Home, NEAR, INPA on the skills dimensions of migration, which I don't see very much covered, unfortunately, in this panorama of programs that you've shown. Maybe it's under legal migration and mobility. So I would like to ask you, Federica, whether you didn't find really anything about skills, talents, and this area, especially that member states are more and more asking for skilled workers at medium level, high level, because of the demographic transition we are going through in Europe. So initiatives like the talent partnership, talent pool, the new directives on how to attract skilled workers from all over the world, how are they reflected or not yet reflected in the programs? This is the first question. The second one is about the methodology. I'm asking whether in the analysis of your programs, you also considered how far a new program builds on the result of a previous program. Because it seems like sometimes in our experience, this link is not there. So we reinvent the wheel in every program, but maybe you could capture whether there was some link and see what worked well in order to inspire new programs or not. The suggestion would be to share the results with colleagues in Brussels. I think even those who are working in this area, and we are many, many more and growing, miss this comprehensive picture that you're giving. So I think it would be very useful also in Brussels. Thank you.
Thanks. So next, Johannes.
Yes, hello, good morning still. My name is Johannes Binder from the Austrian Development Agency. Can you hear me? I'm just asking because I got the new hardware this morning, new headset. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I have witnessed the discussion at the OECD DAC on the renewal of migration policy until about 24 months ago. And as far as I understood, OECD DAC eligible programs are oriented towards protective measures and human rights support, and in not any way restrictive. So European Union programs which are restrictive at core or partial would, as according to OECD DAC policy, not be eligible as a development program or development project. The only area which is accepted is the narrow area of the fight or the prevention on smuggling and human trafficking. That was at least the discussion until 2 years ago, 18 months ago. So there is a very clear OECD DAC policy on what is accepted under development cooperation and what is not accepted. And there is no mixture about restrictive measures and protective measures. But I've found it also very interesting that you evaluated also this kind of mixed approach. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Johannes. So Chiara, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this presentation and also for this project. I'm looking forward to see the results. I had a couple of questions, mostly related to internal funds. First, on the methodology, I was wondering whether you looked at the funds managed under shared management, so by the member states. So, and in such case, whether you looked at all the different national programs, which is many. So if or whether your research was more related to the level of the regulation for all the various home affairs funds. Then still on the internal funds, I was wondering whether you can share any preliminary findings related to, especially I'm interested in the restrictive measures approach, which I find very, very insightful for the external dimension. I was wondering whether you have anything also on that. I understand that your research is less advanced on that part, but maybe there is something that you could share related, especially to the current MFF as compared to the previous one. Then one last point, I was also wondering whether you looked at all the different inclusion measures, for example, all the measures related to education, housing, employment for migrants inside the EU, and whether that falls into any of your categories, maybe the legal migration one, but I was just curious to know. Thanks.
I'll give it to Federica and we'll collect maybe do the same round for the next session. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the questions. So the first point was skills, talents, and all the discussion ongoing. So this is captured in the data sets either under legal mobility measures. But if we go back in time, some of those objectives were also captured under migration and development. So yes, they are included, and many times skill partnerships, the development of talent partnerships, and so on, are coded under legal mobility, unless they are really included under a broader development projects, so enhancing local skills for local development, not in view of traveling to Europe and migrating to Europe. In that case, and this pertains mostly to the past, these are captured under the sub-policy area migration and development, but they are actually there. Concerning how far a program builds on the previous one, so this is one of the explanatory factor that I'm trying to consider then for the analysis. So to what extent, for example, evaluations of previous programs affect the development and the design of new ones. if they play a role together with also, of course, the role of advocacy groups and so on in pushing forwards those evaluations. Of course, I'm not at that stage yet, but for example, if we compare the transition from the trust fund to the current NDCI, we see quite a lot of development based on, well, we see a link really between the interventions planned under the EU Trust Fund and the current programming in the geographic programs under NDCI. So somehow all those analysis and evaluations that we're trying to invite somehow the Commission not to give up on some of the projects, the development projects that we're funding under the Trust Fund once the new NDCI would come into force. So right now have been taken on board. We really see a continuation between EU Trust Fund projects, especially for Africa, and the geographic programs in that specific country. So that's something that I see. But when it comes to other programs, this is something that I would like to explore, because it was one of the points that I wanted to address. And yeah, considering sharing, I'm in that process of sharing a bit with the European Commission, because most of the data are also missing on their side as well. Because of all the institutional transition, actually it was very hard to recollect all the data from 2000 onwards, because of course there have been changes in terms of responsibility between DG NEAR, then INPA, and so on and so forth. And all the information were really scattered across DGs, across units, and we had to recombine them. So recently I presented that to DG Home, and they asked me for the data because they hadn't them. So actually that was a huge endeavor, but it's also useful, of course, from their side to comment on it. And one of the interesting comments, for example, that I had in reading, for example, the restrictiveness index, was to consider, for example, that most of control and border control measures are not that expensive. So to take into account that the nature of the intervention might affect then the index if I combine the level of restrictiveness with the amount dedicated for that specific measure. So that was, for example, a reflection that was made by one of the Commission officer I spoke to. But this is I'm in that phase of sharing actually those data. Concerning the question about protection measures and DAC by the colleague from the Austrian Development Agency. So one of the ways in which, so it is true that in the current NDCI, there is an attempt at really dedicating protection measures really to protection of migrants, compared, for example, to the trust fund where many protection measures, especially in the trust fund, had a strong control component. But one of the ways to compensate for that, and this might be a strategic choice, is to really broaden the definition of those measures, and everything then can be done once, could be done, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that it will, but could be done once these measures is used to support some specific intervention. So objectives have become really broad, also especially when it comes to countering human smuggling or protecting migrants, in a way that was not feasible in the past, where the definition of protection measures was really precise and was really targeting a specific intervention compared to now. So broadening these definitions might affect the eligibility somehow of those measures, allowing them to be included and then affecting them the impact on the ground, of course, because a lot of opportunities are there. Concerning internal funds, I'm not looking at national programs of AMIF, first of all, but because you at ECRE were doing that already, so that was an addition. So it was it was not necessary, and I knew how hard it was. But for the same reasons for which I excluded actually the EDF, I excluded then the national programs in AMIF, because they are under the control, and even more under the control of the member states. So it's really the member states who are in charge of that programming. And with after also some discussions with the Commission, they also agreed that they have limited then control on what can be done through the national programs, through AMIF, once the general program has been agreed. So I'm not looking at the national programs, but I'm looking at union actions and emergency actions and all the other programs funded through the ISF and so on and so forth. Yeah, and I guess I addressed, concerning some of the results on the internal funds. It's really preliminary, so I would be happy then to exchange afterwards directly if you want to do so, also based on the experience that you developed at ECRE for the analysis of the internal funds. So I would be happy about it.
Thank you, Federica. So probably we still have time for 1 or 2 brief questions. So Eleanor and Andrew, and then we will close the session.
Thank you very much, Federica, for the presentation, and congratulations also on the very nice work. I'd like to ask you maybe 2 questions. I'll try to be brief. The first one is regarding whether you focused on thematic data on the 30% of NDCI that is dedicated to climate action. That component is a larger portion than the 10% dedicated to migration. So in case you sort of looked into that thematic component, whether you think that there's space to embed migration and adaptation into climate mainstreaming and the pool of funds that goes into climate mainstreaming. And then a second point, I think I found it very interesting, your point on creating the appearance of control when also keeping the development focus, and certainly that has buy-in from politicians and policymakers in the EU. But I was wondering whether your assessment, and maybe also evidence from the data, is that this might find support in partner countries as well, sort of anticipating in the way we frame the use of funds also calls for more balanced partnerships, more equal partnerships, and so on. Thank you.
And Andrew?
Thanks, Federica. I suppose in terms of the presentation, I kind of understood more about the trajectory, the first research question. But I was interested in maybe a bit more information on the drivers, because I suppose when I think about the EU budget, I think about political process, which is co-decision, where the European Parliament is quite closely involved, where I'd imagine political alignments and voting behaviour in the Parliament might be relevant. And so I was wondering the extent to which within this data set it might be possible to include these kind of variables related to political behaviour within the EU institutions, which I suspect might have some influence on some of these, or potentially, hypothetically, might have influence on trajectory, and might allow also some assessment of kind of maybe effects, because we've seen quite a significant politicization of migration. And I wonder if that has also had effects since 2016. So it's really to think about the political process within the institutions as a potential driver of the events that you're monitoring. Thanks.
So Federica, 2 or 3 minutes you have to answer and summarize up your presentation. So.
Thank you very much. So that's a very good point about the thematic component. We didn't, and I think it's worth expanding on it. Yeah, I will definitely take that into account, because then the link with the climate change, and then yeah, that's something that we could expand definitely. At the beginning, the idea was even to trace migration-related measures in funding for environment, we didn't because it was too much, but at least the thematic component for NDCI could be a relevant addition. Concerning the strategic, well, the appearance of control and the strategic approach, I think this also relates to the questions about the role of actors. I think this is something that can be explored then at the level of, I mean, if we look deeper into the different programs and then the relevance that different actors might have, also the reactions and the role that actors on the ground have in designing it, in challenging it, might say something about it. So that's also a good point. So concerning the drivers, that's exactly actually the step that I'm planning, to really understand how the different political processes might have affected the evolution of the trajectory. So, for example, we then collected as a side data collection, all the evaluations and interventions at the level of the parliament, commenting on the budgetary proposals and the previous funding. So we would like, for example, to see how the role of the parliament in it, and how over time the political processes are affecting those developments. That was really the original starting point. The idea would be now to select some cases where we see some interesting changes across time compared to the past, across different programs, across MFF, and then link them to the political processes ongoing. 2016 could be a date, but also dating back, actually, I think that might also be relevant. But I think that this can be done by selecting some cases and some interesting changes that I see over time across different programs, really comparing how, for example, some programs have evolved over time and the role of the political processes behind it. But that would be the second set. But that was actually the starting point. So what's the role of the political processes, but also what's, for example, the role of bureaucratic dynamics, and how these factors combine to explain then the evolution of the different fundings. That would be the idea and the challenge to try to explore it. Yeah.
And I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you again, Federica, for a great presentation, and thank you everyone for coming and all your questions. So I just want to end with the session with applause for Federica. So please.